In the eastern corner of Wyoming, in a low ridge of hills near a place called Sunrise, there is a hole in the ground stained deep red. Somebody was digging that hole 12,840 years ago, using deer antlers and the leg bones of animals as tools. It is the oldest documented mine in North or South America. Not the oldest of its kind, the oldest of any kind, and what they were extracting was not gold or copper or flint or anything you could kill something with. It was paint. The site has a name that sounds like a filing error, which is roughly what it is. Powers II. In the official register, it is Site 48PL330 in Platte County in the Hartville Uplift of eastern Wyoming. I want to flag something about that before we go on, because the modern brain files pigment somewhere near decoration and decoration somewhere near optional. That is not what this was. These were people living at the tail end of the last ice age on the North American plains, in an environment that could kill them a dozen ways. Everything they carried had to earn its place on their backs, and they were operating a quarry. So the first question is not how old the mine is, it is what could possibly be worth that. The answer starts with how much of it they took. Between 2017 and 2020, a team led by Spencer Pelton, who is now the Wyoming state archaeologist, cut a controlled trench through a previously undocumented section of the quarry. The trench was 6 meters long and 1 meter wide. Out of that single slot in the ground came several thousand artifacts, and the density is the number that stopped me. The site contains over 30 chipped stone tools per square meter. 30. Picture a square of ground about the size of a bath mat and 30 worked stone tools inside it, and then picture that repeating. Pelton's own assessment is that beyond being a quarry, the artifact assemblage at Powers II is one of the densest and most diverse ever found in the early Paleoindian record of the Americas. They also recovered the mining tools themselves, animal bones and deer antlers, used to lever the hematite out of the rock, shell beads. Some of the oldest canid remains from any American archaeological site. This was not somebody stopping to scrape a handful of red dirt on their way past. This was a work site, operated for roughly 1,000 years, and then the projectile points came back from analysis, and they were not from Wyoming. The points recovered at Powers II come from a range of locations across the region. One source is the Edwards Plateau in central Texas. That is about 1,000 miles away. Now there are two ways to read that, and both of them are interesting. Either people were physically travelling that kind of distance, or the stone was moving between hands across the continent. Neither one describes an isolated band scratching a living within sight of the same hill. The researchers point out that the reasoning also works in reverse, because red ochre turns up at Paleoindian sites throughout the American mid-continent, and Powers II makes it likely that a great deal of it came out of this one deposit. Sit with the shape of that. A single hole in eastern Wyoming, quite possibly supplying the pigment used across the middle of a continent 12,500 years ago. Which brings us back to the question we started with. What is red ochre actually for? The answer people usually give is ritual, and that is true, but on its own it is a lazy answer, because it makes these people sound like they organised a 1,000-year mining operation to decorate things. Ochre appears in graves. It gets sprinkled through burials and used to paint the dead, and it turns up in Clovis caches of finished tools across the plains. That part is well documented and it is genuinely important. But it is also, and this took me by surprise, extremely useful. Ochre is an antibacterial agent. Indigenous groups across the world have used it for tanning hides because it slows the breakdown of collagen and preserves the leather. Ground into powder, it works as an aggregate in resin adhesives, which is how you fix a stone point onto a wooden shaft and have it stay there. It has been used as a wood preservative, as an insect repellent, as sun protection on skin, and as medicine, internal and external. So what they were mining out of that Wyoming hillside was closer to a hardware store than a paint pot. Glue, tanning agent, preservative, sunscreen, medicine, and yes, the colour you used to bury someone you loved. A material that does all of that is worth a 1,000-year quarry. It is possibly worth a walk from Texas, and none of this was confirmed until 4 years ago. The man who spent the longest arguing for this site was named George Frison. He was an archaeologist at the University of Wyoming and he began working at Powers II in 1986. I'll admit, my instinct when covering these finds is to look for who stood in the way. But here, there's no villain to point at. Nobody suppressed Powers II. There was no geofact argument, no contamination charge, no committee of skeptics flying in to declare the stones natural. The dates are Clovis era and sit comfortably inside everything the field already accepts. Nobody had to be talked out of anything. What took 34 years was simply that this kind of proof is slow. You cannot rush undisturbed ground. You get one trench, one season at a time, and you record everything, and eventually you have enough to publish. Frison ran out of years before the ground ran out of questions. That is a different kind of loss than being disbelieved, and I'm not sure it is a smaller one. So what actually changes here? Not the timeline. This is not a video about pushing anything back. What changes is the picture. The version of Clovis most people carry around is small mobile bands with spears, following mammoths across an empty continent, improvising as they go. Powers II does not fit inside that. A fixed resource, worked for 1,000 years, tools arriving from 1,000 miles away, material leaving in every direction across the mid-continent. That is not wandering, that is a supply chain, and somebody knew where it was and somebody kept coming back. The last detail I will leave you with is the simplest one. They dug it with antlers, no metal, no picks, nothing but bone and stone and whatever they could carry up that ridge. And they kept at it, generation after generation, for a period longer than the entire span between the Roman Empire and now, for a hole full of red dirt that was worth all of that. There is no mystery to solve at Powers II. It is not disputed, and there is nothing left to argue about. There is only a hillside in Wyoming that quietly demolishes the idea that the first Americans were improvising, and a man who spent 34 years proving it and missed the ending by 2 years. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next video.